Our first lesson this day comes to us from the book of Genesis. There in the 15th chapter, before David, before Moses, 400 years before, in the time of Abram. Abram had left home and family to follow where God would lead. And 12 years have gone by. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house shall be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars if you're able to count them. And then said to him, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And then he said to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give to you this land to possess. But, he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? The Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, 3 years old, and a young pigeon. And Abram brought all these things and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other as a sacrifice. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them all away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. The Lord said to Abram, Know this for certain, your offspring shall be aliens in a land not their own. They shall be slaves there. They shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I will give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Turning then to the gospel, we read in the book of Luke. This morning at the 13th chapter, beginning at the 31st verse. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to Jesus, Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you. Jesus said to them, Go and tell that fox for me. Listen, I'm casting out demons, I'm performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day, I finish my work. Yet today and tomorrow and the next day, I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed except in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wing, and you are not wanting. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. So end our lessons for this day. On Wednesday, as we gather together to talk about the Harry Potter series and the similarities to the gospel, what we saw here was a beginning with invitation. One owl comes to Harry's house, and then because they ignore the invitation, another owl and another and another and another. And despite their ignoring the invitations, finally, Hagrid comes with the call, with the invitation. that he is to come and go to school. And from that we turned to each other and said, so what's your calling? What is it you've been called to do in this life? Is it like Jesus' description of what's the great law? That you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself? Is that your call? Is it to go out into the world and to baptize and teach and preach and share the good news? That is for every member so to do. Is it to redeem the broken and repair the breach? Is it to build trust? Is it to take the raw and perfect it and make it more professional and more beautiful? A neighboring church had closed during the 1920s, during the time of the Great Depression. And for 20 years, that church sat vacant. And so it was that when the families came together again and reopened the church and rededicated it, they promised their children and made their children promise them on their deathbeds, your task is to keep this church open. And that security and that safety and that perseverance became a terrible burden for the congregation, particularly when they did have to close and they felt as though they'd let down the generation before them. Is our call to protect from loss? Is it to build up great affluence? Is it security? What is your calling? What is your purpose? Our purpose has been countercultural in the world today. When so many across Western Europe and across America have been leaving churches and churches have been closing, we've been doing more baptisms than deaths. We've been having more weddings than seems possible. We've had new members every year to where the church has doubled. We've had new members in the choir, some who are not actually members of the church, but simply want to sing and share their faith in this way. What I think we've become as a church is a community of caring. That in the midst of all the things we've been about, rebuilding the building, building up an organ, finding musicians to play, creating missions locally and around the world, our task has not been about those things. Because at each time, as we look to the replacing of the organ, we envisioned a time when it would have been here already. And I recall the refugees describing to us when they first arrived, this is the church that we want to be able to bring our grandchildren to, and to describe that when we were first new in America, this was our home, this was our family. We've become a church of connections, a community of caring, who are there for each other in the midst of all the things that are there. So who are the people in your life who have been those connections? Who are the ones who've given you your values, your traditions, who've been for you that reminder to keep faithful, to be honest, to be true? Who are the ones who've stood beside you to encourage and to challenge, and sometimes to chastise along the way? Someone this week pointed me to a TED Talk. Do you know what TED Talks are? These are brief pieces on the internet that are speeches that you can hear anyone around the world who's an expert in their field. And one is named Brené Brown. She's a researcher. She has a master's in social work, a PhD in social work from Texas. And she's been researching what it is to be human. She's come back saying what it means to be human more than anything else is having connections, having relationships with other people. Because our connections, our community, those things, those people around us, help us to feel worthy, help us have a sense of worthiness and belonging and love. And the opposite of all of that is shame, because shame causes us to feel worthless, to feel unworthy, to be unloved. We feel as though we can always be skinnier. We can always be more successful. We can always have a bigger house. We can always keep the house cleaner. We can always do more. And we beat ourselves up with our shame. But Brené Brown described that underneath both shame and connections is vulnerability. that when we are vulnerable, we're open to shame. But the only way in which we establish connections is to risk, to be vulnerable, to reach out to another to say, I need a job. To reach out to another to say, I think you're attractive, I'd like to go out on a date. To reach out to your spouse for affection, knowing you might get shot down. To reach out to another to say the time has come when you need to leave. Being vulnerable is hard. Being vulnerable, it's a double-edged sword. We don't know whether we're going to be shamed by it and lose our sense of worth, or whether perhaps this may lead us in a whole new direction beyond where we are today into something different, something more. What Brown describes is underneath our connections is that the people who have found connections with each other live in a community that reinforces it. A group of people who all believe that you are worthy, that you do belong, and they reinforce that for you. Because individually we tear ourselves down and we believe we're not worthy, we don't belong. We have a terrible sense of self-worth, and we need one another to encourage us and to strengthen us. She discovers that in these communities of caring where there are connections, there are three things that always seem to be there. First is courage. Courage doesn't mean that you go into great battles. The word courage comes from a Latin word, cor, and cor means your heart. These are people who live their life as if their heart depended on it, who tell their story as heartfelt, who share what's really dear to them with one another, who risk sharing what they feel passionate about. And they do so with other people, realizing that at times they were unworthy and they've been forgiven. So they can forgive others, they can be compassionate to others. They have the courage to be compassionate to those who feel unworthy. And with this, with that courage, with that compassion, we develop connections, one with another. And we're there for each other in all that is to come. We as a congregation have welcomed in more members than we ever had before. We've doubled who we are. We've also welcomed in visitors who've been with us for a time. As your pastor, what has been hardest for me have been to let go of those relationships, to say goodbye to friends who sometimes slip away. But our hope and prayer is to stay connected, no matter how many miles and how many years, to reach out and still be there, just as we always were before. All of which brings me to Abram's story. Because Abram had left home and family. He left everything that was familiar. He left that community of caring. Because he had one relationship that was important. That relationship with God. And that's what he was passionate about. That's what gave his life meaning. He'd been into battle several different times and accumulated great wealth and great possessions. But throughout this 12 years, he still didn't have a child, and now he was approaching 90 years of age, and it didn't seem possible that he and his wife could have a child yet in life. It's one thing to be a success. It's less meaningful when you don't have a successor to give it to. And so he appeals to God saying, what's it all for? Am I just to be an instrument of your peace, or do I get what I want in this relationship also? And as he has been patient, God describes to him two things. First, yes, you will have that descendant. You will have as many heirs as there are stars in the heavens or grains of sand on the beach. But also, there must be an emergency somewhere. I don't know what it is. If we could have someone who would check on it for us, please. It's an Amber Alert. Thank you. We are a community of connections and caring and being there for one another so we don't turn our cell phones off. We do care about one another. Abram wanted so much to believe that he would have heirs who would succeed him and receive all of the successes that had happened in his life. And in the midst of this, God caused him to go to sleep and to have a vision of what the future might be. Not just that he would have a child, but that his children would have a land that they would inherit. They would be able to occupy this place and see in it all the blessings that were there. But you've got to be patient. It's not going to be today. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's going to be 400 years from now. This is like telling Standish and the Puritan pilgrims about what today is going to be, 400 years after 1620. Or for us, 400 years beyond space exploration, in the year 2416, what life is going to be about. That there will be a community of faith. There will be a people who believe in God. And in the midst of that, God asks of Abram that you need to do something to reinforce your role and God's role. You need to take and make a sacrifice. Take a heifer, take a goat, take a sheep, take a lamb, take a dove, take a pigeon, and sacrifice all these, because that's what the things of this earth are for, is for sacrifices. And who are we? We're the ones to worship God. And who is God? God is the one who will be there for us, not only in this time, but 400 years from now. And we have this relationship, these roles. We can't be God. But just as other people may try to make us a sacrifice, may try to enslave us, God will be there for us and provide for us. And for Abram, that promise allows him to go on further until the child does come, because it is not immediate. And for 400 years, they did as God commanded until they could come into the land and take possession of it. So also with Jesus, when Herod comes to him and sends his Pharisees that say, Herod's out to kill you, Jesus isn't worried, because he knows who he is and what his tasks are and what his responsibilities are. Somehow in this life, if we could just take the worry off of our shoulders, if we could only do our role and be in our connections, one with another, being vulnerable to each other, without worry, how much more we could accomplish, how much more we could be without having to worry about it and destroying ourselves. In this gospel passage, in these 5 short verses, the verb to want comes up 3 different times. Herod wants to kill you. Jesus wants Jerusalem to come to him. Jerusalem didn't want to. Our wants, our desires, are different for each one of us. Sometimes they're malicious. Sometimes they're for revenge, as Herod wants to kill. Sometimes we want not to be included and not to be part. And sometimes all we want is to welcome home and to care for, to live into that future time and future relationships that will be. Described to you at different times that summers growing up, we used to come here to central New York. We'd go up to Fulton where my family had a farm. And as the youngest grandchild, my job on the farm was to collect the eggs from the chicken house. Have you ever gone into a chicken house with the chickens there? It's the most frightening thing to do to a child that you could ever do. It's about double the size of an outhouse and has no light. And inside, from the light of the door, you see that there are all these shelves, and on every shelf there are nests filled with birds. And as you reach in to take their eggs, they peck at you. They bite at you. They scream. They flutter. They fly in your face. Until finally my grandfather taught me to take some bird seed with you. And before you go to get the eggs, throw the chicken seed outside and get the birds to go out there. And then go in and get their eggs. The hen will defend her eggs to her death. It's said that if a fox gets in the hen house, the first victim that will die is the hen, so that he can get to the eggs. I had a good friend growing up who wanted for nothing. He received his father's name where his father was James, he was Jamie. He had beautiful, good looks. He had everything he could desire. He went to the very best colleges. On his 16th birthday, he was given a beautiful car. Anything and everything he could desire. Anything he wanted, he could have. What he didn't want was to be part of it, to be part of that family. What he wanted was drugs. He separated himself from the family. And I remember his father, who all he wanted in life was for his son to come home. He was like that hen, wanting Jerusalem. He was like Jesus, wanting us all to come home. He's like the father of the prodigal and the elder who simply wants the family to be one and is willing to give his own life for it. We are a family of connections. Sometimes it hurts as we lose those connections. Sometimes we need to dream dreams of what it will be 400 years from now, when those on the West Coast feel a lot closer, when we're all brought home to be one. Amen.